dames en heren, en welkom bij de internationale conferentie met als thema hoe verander je de Surinaamse economie. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the international conference. The topic of the evening is how do you change the Surinamese economy? Mag ik u allen beleefd vragen om op te staan voor het zingen van het eerste en het tweede couplet van het volkslied. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the national anthem. Before the official start of our program, I will formally introduce myself. My name is Rahim, and I am your master of ceremony of the evening. I would like to give a special welcome to the engine behind tonight's event, Ms. Maya Palu, all distinguished guests, and I would also like to give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker of the evening, Mr. Rahim Taghizadegan. As it was previously announced, the topic of the evening is how do you change the Surinamese economy? And I would like to welcome to the front Ms. Maya Palu for the official opening.
Goedenavond allen. Ik wil u van harte welkom heten en bedankt voor uw komst vanavond. Vandaag hebben we een gastspreker uit Zwitserland op bezoek. Een nuclear physicist, maar beter bekend als Austrian economist. Hij is eigenlijk hier op bezoek voor een paar dagen, omdat we afhankelijk begonnen met een plan enkele maanden geleden, hoe wij de Surinaamse economie met nieuwe ideeën en eigenlijk een andere manier van denken als Austrian economics zouden kunnen wijzigen, een andere richting zouden kunnen geven dan wat we de afgelopen 50 jaar in Suriname hebben gedaan. Nou, daar is hij dus al enkele maanden mee bezig. En dat hebben we dus ook vanuit zeg maar de NPS in een commissie vormgegeven. Maar het is de bedoeling dat het dus een landelijke discussie wordt en dat de ideeën landelijk gedeeld worden met ieder. Zodat we gezamenlijk kunnen gaan kijken naar hoe wij dingen anders in Suriname kunnen gaan aanpakken ten opzichte van wat er de afgelopen 50 jaar is gedaan. En als je kijkt naar geopolitiek, als we kijken naar de veranderingen die er internationaal momenteel plaatsvinden in landen zoals El Salvador, Argentinië, voornamelijk in Amerika momenteel, zie je drastische wijzigingen en vooral drastische wijzigingen in de aanpak van corruptie. Corruptiebestrijding, transparantie en hoe er gegaan wordt eigenlijk met efficiëntie voor de private sector, ondernemerschap, innovatie en hoe er gegaan wordt met belastingen voornamelijk en het stimuleren van productie in de private sector. Vandaar dus de vraag enkele maanden geleden dat ik ook, hoe brengen we dit tot stand? En zo zijn we tot de beste van de wereld gekomen. We hebben hier afgelopen maand Dr. Laffer gehad. En nu hier als gast Rahim. En vorige week zijn we gekomen, parlementariër uit Zwitserland. Dus verschillende buitenlandse experts die gezamenlijk met onze lokale experts gaan nadenken over oplossingen voor onze economie. Het is een manier om te proberen om dingen anders te doen. Dus ik wil u bedanken voor de komst vanavond. Nogmaals, welkom te heten. En ik kijk uit naar Rahim's presentatie en ik hoop u ook.
Thank you, Ms. Maya Pardo. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Rahim Taghizadegan, an economist, entrepreneur, and educator in the direct tradition of the Austrian school. With a background in nuclear physics, he has lectured at leading universities across Europe and the US, and is the founder of Scholarium, a unique institution dedicated to interdisciplinary education. Rahim is a prolific author with over 15 books to his name, including Austrian School for Investors and the Zero Interest Trap. He has been an advisor to financial institutions, a consultant for wealth management, and a pioneer in integrating Bitcoin into economic theory and university curriculum. As an investor and entrepreneur, he is actively involved in innovative ventures worldwide and serves as a chief economist for Surinamese politician Maya Pardo. May I welcome to the stage Mr. Rahim Taghizadegan.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Thank you for bestowing the honor of me to share this evening with me. It's my first time in Suriname. Already got a pretty good impression the first few days that I'm here. It's a truly unique country. I think we spend to show how much we have. We want to get status, for luxury consumption. So usually it's the worst advice you can follow if you want to get rich. Don't imitate people who look rich. And in a similar fashion, I'd say if a society wants to become wealthy, it's usually not a good idea to imitate societies that are wealthy these days. Because what you see again is only the visible thing. It's the capacity to spend money, to have lots of stuff, to enjoy the fruits of the things that you've inherited. But those societies tend to be very different from the societies at the point when this wealth was generated. Because wealth does not come from the visible. Wealth comes from the invisible. And a large part of that invisible is called capital. It's a quite difficult concept. The most important part of capital, and that's particularly true in the modern economy, is invisible. It's the capacity to increase productivity, and it lies in habits, experiences, skills, even kind of mentality sometimes. But of course it lies in arranging resources as well. But it's not the resources themselves, it's the way how you use them and how you're able to use them in the right time and the right connection. So capital is usually ignored because it's not so easily visible. You just see the physical resources, you see the money prices of it, and a lot of economics has ignored that kind of invisible structure behind wealth. Now, if a society is wealthy, it can also do something that you can see with some rich people. It's only if you're wealthy enough you can afford a particular kind of stupidity. A kind of stupidity where you imagine things that have nothing to do with reality. But you don't care, it doesn't matter. You can try things that will not work out, and you can try them again as long as you have wealth to squander. You can have all kind of illusions and ideas. And that happens in wealthy societies. People, as a kind of luxury consumption, endorse ideas that are in the long run detrimental. That's a kind of status consumptions. So people who want to have status in rich societies usually are not wearing like the fancy gold necklaces. That's usually the underclass imitating what they think looks like being rich. It's rich people actually endorsing ideas that make them look good, so they can acquire status. And it's quite dangerous now if you want to imitate the wealthy societies of today. So you'll inherit some of these status signaling ideas. So be careful when Westerners talk about economic development and democracy and the rule of law and stuff. Part of that can be virtue signaling, trying to look like a good person who cares about. And one of the detrimental ideas that emerged out of Europe in particular is the idea that poverty will be something exceptional that you have to blame someone for, and there's a guilt behind it, that something is like a disease, you've attracted it somewhere, or someone is to blame. That's all wrong. Poverty, in the sense of a mode of survival, is the natural state of mankind, unfortunately. It has been the natural state of mankind for most of our ancestors have lived in survival mode. That of course has grounded them and has made them able to survive and pass the genes on to us. But it's only fairly recently that this particular phenomenon emerged, where groups of people step out of this survival mode, and it's no longer the resources that limit the population. It's like who can get as much food, and if there's more people, there's less food per person, so people die off as this kind of survival mode that all organisms more or less are living under. And fairly recently, the phenomenon of open-ended win-win wealth creation emerged. It emerged first in Europe. It's still only partly understood what was happening here. It went from different locations. At one point in time, in the 19th century, part of Europe, most central Europe, where most people lived as their fathers and forefathers before in poverty, in abject poverty, seeing most of their own children die. They were a latecomer to this kind of wealth creation, and it was in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in the 19th century. It was fairly late. It was a poor agrarian society that in very quick time, within a generation, adopted this kind of mode of increasing wealth. And that's when the Austrian School of Economics emerged at the end of the 19th century. It was a tradition that had similarities to the Scottish Enlightenment, and the Scottish Enlightenment emerged 100 years before, when in the British Islands this kind of wealth processes were discovered, no one really understood it at the time. It was discovered by the people. It was very gradual processes that then had suddenly, in short times, you could see a difference in living standards and in the dynamic behind it. It probably, the first time you saw some of that dynamic catching on was in northern Italy, but it was not enough to really lift living standards a lot for most people. It moved on to other places in Europe. Next was northern, the Baltic Sea, the Hanseatic League cities. Then it was, or is now the Netherlands, Holland. Then it was the British Islands. Then it was Central Europe. Then it was the US. It was parts of Asia, and it spread around the world. And it's only fairly recently that most people on the planet live in productive structures where what you do is usually not the same what your parents did or your grandparents did. So it's a much more dynamic order with a lot of disadvantages, of course. One phenomenon of this modern wealth order is crisis. Modern societies fall into crisis, and the Austrian school in the 19th century was not only studying wealth and how an economy changes, it was studying a society in crisis. It's the reason why there's one Austrian school of economics, but there are like 3 Viennese school of psychology, because a lot of people have mental issues coping with these kind of dynamics happening, a lot of neurotics emerging. So wealth is not something cheap that just falls off, it's a trade-off, and it means a lot of change to accept it, to adapt it. And let me try to figure out what's behind that change. I think it's capital, and capital has 2 sides to it, and each side has 2 sides again. The 2 sides of capital are savings and entrepreneurship. And it sounds very materialistic and formal, but it's much more cultural and invisible than you may assume. Savings, like entrepreneurship, has 2 sides each, a cultural side and an institutional side, and both have to match each other, and then savings and entrepreneurship need to come together to bring this kind of dynamic change in productivity and production structures that we consider wealth today. Savings on the cultural side is a quite conspicuous change in habits. It's a change in habits that does not come natural, it's counterintuitive, it's not using the resources you can use now, but refraining from something that seems crucial to our survival. And it takes a long-term perspective, and it was a long process for societies to acquire that capacity and potential. Now we know it's not unique to a particular culture, it's just a change in habits that adopts or makes it possible to embrace part of this modern change in production structure. So it's the willingness of people to forego consumption and do something very abstract. Economists call it a lowering of the time preference, that you adapt your whole pattern to a longer time perspective. And it's no longer the sooner the better. You try to manage, equalize over a longer perspective. And of course that needs to be possible. And that's the institutional side to it. And what's the institutional side? Whenever people have more because they have not consumed it, in most societies, which are quite tribal from our instincts, it gets risky, it seems unfair, it seems problematic, there's a lot of pressure, and if you don't confront the pressure, it leads to plunder. So whenever there are resources that are somewhere concentrated and it's not with the proper center of a society or a tribe, it's usually are the religious leaders or the political leaders, and in most societies we're both at the same thing. And you see like wealth or savings emerge in places that are not at the proper hierarchical center of society. It's really hard to maintain that. And the way to maintain that in Europe was usually doesn't work out. Of course, the more urban, the more diverse a society, the more you have these potential concentrations, and money emerges as a means to exchange wealth between people that are foreign to each other, that don't trust each other, that don't know each other yet. That's why they go for money. But money can be manipulated easily, because most people need kind of help in figuring out what's money, what's the kind of thing you use for exchange, and that was done by mints, imprinting on the coins you used, that coin is a kind of money. And this minting, of course, has been abused throughout history. There are very few exceptions. Whenever mints were operating, what happened frequently is a mint authority, usually under the regime of let's say a politician, a prince, a king, would withdraw the coins from circulation, would remold them with a lesser quantity of a more expensive metal that was used, and would remint those coins again. So from a few mints you can make more, from a few coins you can make more coins by adding less valuable metal over time. And that happened almost universally throughout history. It happened in the Roman Empire, it happened in every empire where minting was done, and it happened in Europe in almost every principality. But with the downfall of the Roman Empire, we had a kind of division into lots of small entities, aided by the geography of Europe, and it's this kind of decentralization that led to a financial structure that emerged. And for the first time, it was possible to have access to a savings technology where you could concentrate savings as a person that's not part of the authority, not part of the establishment, not part of the center of society. And it emerged through a competition of mints where you had like lots of differently minted coins. And you had a hard time, of course, figuring out what is what. And over time, you had experts figuring that out. And they realized that, of course, you can check something, you can weigh the stuff, and you can do an easy physical procedure. You can look at the density of the stuff. And then you figure out if there are lots of different denominations, lots of different mints, probably that's not the standard you want to use because it changes. It's not reliable. So it was both Italian merchants that came up with a new way to define money. It seems a bit arbitrary, but it had one advantage. What was their definition? They said, we will define the unit of money as a florin, and it's just a certain amount of weight of precious metal. And anyone who's doing exchange or banking businesses just has to say that. So it's a physical procedure. It's not a government procedure to figure that out. And interestingly, this coin of florin wasn't even minted. It was not that in forest they now started to mint it. There were sometimes they were minted, but it was a standard. So you would have contracts fixed in florin, and you could pay in any coin you want. But you had one way to exchange between these coins, and you could now see and have a standard that's independent from the mints. It's a standard set and a way to define for private contract parties what's the value they want to transact in. So that was the European standard. Long before there was an official gold standard, most people used silver. But just by having this kind of monetary standard, which the large merchants used in gold, just for the purchasing power being much higher. So if you have large transactions, you want to have something with purchasing power, that led to a decentralized financial structure. But you just had to accumulate and hide these kind of savings. Now, a lot of economists have a hard time in figuring out how that could be good, how that could be useful. Why are people that bury wealth? Like you amass wealth, you bury it, you hide it. How could that be positive? And it's only the Austrian School of Economics that really figured out the paradox of that. It's due to uncertainty. Of course, you need investment, you need to change something real. Just by burying gold, you will not have any returns on that. You'll have to invest it. But investment is hugely uncertain. I can't just say now, okay, I'm going to invest. Investing usually means saying no. A good investor has to say no a lot. So I have to time the exact time and place for an investment. And that makes it necessary to transfer wealth over time and geographically and be independent of my local context and surroundings. So it's a more liquid form. So you have savings to be ready and prepared when the opportunity emerges And when you see the right resources there, and you figure, okay, there's a guy that can really help me do that, there's a good worker, there's the kind of resource I need to create more value out of it, there's a tool becoming available, now I have the liquidity to act upon this situation. And that is fairly unique, that one person could change a production structure within a society. And it's nothing that comes natural, because it's just the savings part, and not invested, of course, that's entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship, again, has two sides. It has a cultural side, and it has an institutional side. It's a very unnatural habit, because it means doing something differently from everyone else. And most successful entrepreneurs look like fools in the beginning. It's impossible to tell, in particular for the really innovative ventures. There's no way you can tell if a good, passionate entrepreneur is a genius or a fool. And of course, many times a genius and a fool are pretty close. And most ventures fail. Like 90% of startups fail. So they were fools, obviously. But you don't know who. One of the 10 is right. Because it does not just depend on the person. It's also not just luck. It depends on the capacity to carry the right amount of uncertainty. And it's a big burden. It's a big burden. Everyone tells you, oh no, I mean, if it works this way, someone else would have tried it. So if no one is doing it that way, it means it won't work. You won't get a lot of encouragement. In particular, in the kind of traditional tribal societies we live in, doing something different can be very dangerous. So our ancestors were not stupid by preventing these kind of errors. Because being foolish in a society survival mode is dangerous for everyone's survival. That's also why in the most harsh surroundings you have very strict social codes. You emerge from the deserts, it's like you can't fool around, but you need fooling around. And either you have like a basis of savings that allows for it, but usually it also needs this cultural aspect of being able to fool around and not lose all your status, not be kicked out of society by doing something different. So society culture needs to be ready to embrace a kind of dynamic inequality, and that's very hard to take because it's very hard to differentiate from the bad kind of inequality, the static inequality. Most societies in the past, in particular the bigger ones, had hugely unfair divisions of wealth and power. Most were locked by static inequality positions of mental squalor, and a few were in a position of power and status and relative wealth. So of course our instinct all tells us that's bad, that's not fair, and it was crucial for our ancestors to have that moral feeling. Because if we compare human societies to primate societies, like chimp societies, they are much more unfair, they are much more cruel, they are much less cooperative, so it's one big chimp who gets all the females, gets all the resources, and it's a constant fight. Human societies have emerged because we are able to cooperate, because we have a more egalitarian view of other human beings, and we don't accept easily that just one person gets everything. But it's static inequality. So a dynamic society will always show dynamic inequality, which is something totally different, but looks similar sometimes. It looks unfair. You don't know why this person, why is he successful? And it's in particular difficult for traditional societies, because suddenly it's like the foreigner maybe, the one with the odd religious ideas, the one who looks like and talks like a fool. And these people can be successful if entrepreneurship can work, if there are savings. And that was, of course, when European societies have failed again and again by appreciating that kind of positive diversity, of someone being from social mobility, that someone from the downtrodden, who you don't accept, you don't respect, suddenly can be very successful and can earn his way up these kind of dynamics where you can't tell from your parents, from your ethnicity, from your background that you are part of the elite, where everyone can be part of an elite, but also everyone at the top can fall down again. It's this kind of dynamic inequality that's very hard to take. So most societies have a hard time, so the culture alone is not sufficient. You need institutions that allow that. And again, it was the very same thing as in the financial infrastructure. It was decentralization in Europe that allowed for this kind of entrepreneurship. It's not because the Europeans were in a way smarter or more tolerant. Not at all. You had the most intolerant people you can imagine, killing their neighbors for another belief set. But the neighbor could move, sometimes by foot, across a mountain, in a very dense, very small piece of land, with a lot of contested little entities. And it's not only the contested little entities where you could change. You could leave to another principality, you could leave to another city, and that's something very interesting that emerged only there first. You have subgroups in a society with their own autonomy. It's not just autonomous principalities and countries, it's also autonomous bodies within societies. So cities in Europe could start to negotiate as a city. And that was the original version of democracy, of course, and it has a longer backstory. It's small groups of people being able to have a kind of autonomy, decide on their own development without some outer power imposing everything, because there was competition. There was competition between different legal areas, and there was competition between cities, and there was competition even between bodies within a city. So in Europe, there emerged a corporation. And first it was not a company corporation. The first corporations were universities, monasteries, the city bodies, private philanthropic bodies, brotherhood, social societies, all kind of bigger bodies. They were autonomous bodies with their own set of laws. Can you imagine that? A university in old Europe, it was forbidden for police to enter because the university had its own laws. And of course they were responsible. It comes from the idea of the clergy, of course, having an autonomy, and it was of course part of this diversity of old Europe, where you have different religions, different ethnicities, different cultures right next to each other, and to figure out none of that on its own would be that tolerant, but by having the possibility. And because not all the power is concentrated in one center of Europe, with the downfall of Rome, it never again, unfortunately, emerged that there was one big center. It was always multiple centers. And that was a very, very gradual process of this. Two sides of savings and two sides of entrepreneurship coming together. Cultural change takes a lot of time. It gets faster every time you can repeat it and imitate it in a way, and you can learn from other people. So it happened faster every time. And how did it happen faster every time? It's by people moving across. So when in northern Italy centralization took over, part of the merchants left. They left to the Baltic Sea. They became the merchants, the financial experts in the Hanseatic League. And when the Hanseatic League fell to centralization again, Prussia emerged, and the big centralized powers, part of the very same people moved to cities like Amsterdam, Antwerp, and so on. And they get brought with them the knowledge, the entrepreneurship, the savings with them to start new businesses, bring new dynamic in a much shorter time. So every time we see this new dynamic happen again, it's quicker. And that's a very positive news. It's a very optimistic message, because in old Europe, the people believed that this kind of wealth was so unique and so culturally unique that no one is going to get it. You need these Europeans everywhere. They need to be colonizers, they need to bring this kind of wealth. No one is going to figure it out how to do it. And we've seen, fortunately, It gets faster every time again, and it's possible in every culture all around the world if you have the right ingredients and you don't fail in the regard of centralization. Centralization is the concentration of power and resources. Sometimes, of course, it's good to concentrate resources, but the thing is, who is deciding on these resources? And having all the resources usually is not a good incentive to make right decisions. So what we want to avoid by decentralization is wrong decisions, because wrong decisions can be extremely harmful. And it was really just this aspect that Europe, which was far behind other cultures, it was far behind China, it was far behind the Muslim parts of the world, it was really the unwashed barbarians. But in the Muslim world, centralization happened with wrong decisions, like shutting down science, shutting down printing, not having printing presses, they shut down their own observatories. And of course you can argue from religion, but I'd say it's just a wrong decision. It's tempting when you don't see the effect, because you think, okay, if they do it for all the people, they have to oblige. And of course, there can be very good reasons. So in the Islamic world, there were bright philosophers, and one of the brightest argued why it's good to not have critical discourse. And his arguments were very strong. His arguments were for centralization. They were against dissidents. Because of course, he told, to look at philosophy. People have been philosophizing for a long time and nothing has come out of it. Because you don't see the invisible thing of it, and you don't see that it has needs a fit between culture and institutions in order to bring something positive. And it needs to be practical. It's not just having ideas that float around. It's trying out new things. That's entrepreneurship. That's a kind of practical dissent. I think it's much more useful than just opinion or dissenting opinions you have. In China, it was one decision by the emperor, with very good reasons again. He said, okay, we had the best ships in the world, large ships, huge ships that could contain cattle, and they could contain even fields, or they had a little plantation on their ship. They were huge ships to sustain the world best. And the emperor came to the conclusion, oh, that's quite risky, we are going to places, we need to focus our resources to where we are, because who knows what will happen, what's out there, probably nothing interesting, because we know we're the center of the world, we know we're the best, so what's out there for us to discover? And he gave the order to destroy the ocean-going ships, and he cut off the most advanced civilization in the world from outside development and from competition. It led to centralization, and of course it stagnated. Of course, its capacity for wealth diminished so much that this once proud civilization became one of the poorest places on the planet. With unimaginable poverty that then, much later on, European visitors discovered and were surprised. How can we live in that kind of squalor? It was not the wrong culture or habits of the Chinese, it was an institutional mismatch. Right? So how do you bring about that kind of change? On the cultural side, usually it takes long, it's very gradual, it's nothing for politics to fix quickly. There's only one way to change culture quickly, that's openness. And that we've seen, and that's behind the miracles in the modern world. We've seen those miracles are not really miracles, they're just repeating what happened before. But the places that show the most dramatic change in the past decades, in the past 50 years or so. So in our modern times, within our generation alive, these small places that open up and offered opportunities for everyone to come and bring savings and entrepreneurship to these places. Those places like Singapore, very similar in its diversity to a place like Suriname, also a tropical location, a very small location, not a lot of natural resources. But one good decision, a of course you can say, okay, it's only a statesman, so let's find a statesman like that. Those are very rare. I think it's more than that. It's of course he inherited something from the British Empire, left over thing, and it was this dispersal and openness of a city-state culture that came from Europe. So when Europe had disappeared, these kind of decentralized structures, Europe was centralizing, and of course it led to the clash between the centers of power, and it led to the worst situation on the planet, the world wars, considered world wars, the most destruction in the least of time happening, unimaginable, how like the highest civilization could fall that deep. Again, clashes between centralized powers, and some very far off destination remained and took the right choice, not to try to centralize again, but to be open and allow for savings and entrepreneurship again to provide wealth, allow for this kind of dynamic inequality. And the best thing I think Lee did was being empathic to his population and figuring out that the culture change is difficult, and talking to the different diverse groups within Singapore and taking them along and telling them, okay, it's your responsibilities, your kids will live in a different world. How can you learn from other groups that are doing better now? Of course, you can react by guilt. You can blame the Chinese, you can blame the British. The Malay did that. But he tried to get rid of this kind of guilt explanation of poverty. It was like, no, you are not poor because you're Malay. You can be as wealthy as everyone else, but look at your habits. Look at what you convey to your children. Do you tell them they are victims? They are poor because someone else is wealthy? Or do you empower them to become as wealthy as anyone else and they have potential? Of course, you don't have to go for riches. But it's this approach that you can improve your life. It's your responsibility. No one's going to bring it to you. That's the empowering thing of entrepreneurship. And it can happen pretty quickly, and it happened. Of course, the Malay in Singapore are wealthy, are in the wealthiest place, one of the wealthiest places on the planet. And we've seen those similar miracles emerge in an even worse place of the planet. The worst you can imagine. You figure out, like, what's the worst place to go to? You go to the desert, of course, but there's nothing. There's nothing, just desert. And very poor tribes that have figured out how to survive in the desert. Who would imagine that you can make the desert bloom and flourish? Who would imagine that people from Europe would move in droves to the desert and settle in the desert from green Europe? Who would imagine that 50 years ago, 60 years ago? And that's what happened in the worst cultural setup, the worst natural setup possible. It was just, again, a remainder from European structures, the Emirates, small entities, and they managed to not centralize, to not have the one big emir who wants to have, like, make Arabia great again, and let's control all the Arabs, because it's great to be an Arab, just being an Arab without improving your situation, without wanting to be proud to be an Arab, because you can't be like everyone else, you're not a victim. And that they managed. And they managed by bringing, of course, lots of people. And interestingly, places like Dubai and Abu Dhabi are now attracting Europeans, lots of Europeans. Why are they attracting them? Because they are offering better conditions for entrepreneurship, better conditions for investment. So some of the best people are leaving Europe these days. And that seems like hard to imagine. Like everyone in the second world, third world dreams about moving to Europe. That's the dream of most of the young people. If they're able to, they want to go to Europe or to the US. And interestingly, the world has become so dynamic and mobile that of course it can turn into a very different situation now. Because wealth is not in land anymore, it's not the land you inherited. Wealth has become more mobile, as it's invisible, it's transportable, it's in the brains of people, it's in the savings they can transport around the world. And of course, you figure out that you may live in a very wealthy society in Austria and Switzerland, but it comes at a price. I have left my home country, Austria. I moved to Switzerland just for that improvement in being able to improve my social situation. In Austria, it's very difficult to do so. If you've inherited well, you live a very comfortable life. Even if you haven't inherited much, it's an okay life. But the change is not to the positive. It's not that you can advance that much. It's not the upward mobility. Why? Because people have become addicted to the obvious things of wealth, of being able to spend. And people think you can solve every problem by spending money because there's money. So we have now in Austria the majority of the population being dependent on government. Can you imagine that? It should be like a poor country. Like the majority of the population is dependent on handouts from government. But it's not handouts, they don't call them handouts. It's jobs, it's professions, it's administrators, it's NGOs, it's journalists, but they're all funded one way or the other through this big government procedure where a minority of the population carries the tax burden, in particular the entrepreneurs. If you start a company in Austria these days, and the valuation increases. Let's say you start something, you had a great idea, you attract investment, it's now valued at 5 million because that's how you do a venture. So it's like you calculate what's the potential of it, and someone gets a share and you can want to give 100% away, so you calculate something like that. In Austria now you have to pay almost a third on that imaginary valuation if ever you want to leave the country. So you're like you're kidnapped there. And in some places already in Europe you have to pay that immediately, which of course would bankrupt any entrepreneur. But it's happened in Norway, it's discussed in France, so lots of people in the wealthiest places in Europe are leaving the place and are looking around the world. A lot of them come to Switzerland, so Switzerland is still doing something right relatively, and of course that's why it's the wealthiest place in Europe these days. And it's attracting a lot of people. But other places are as well. And any place could. And let me tell you about one example. Visiting El Salvador was like one of the worst places on the planet. The murder capital of the world. No one would go there voluntarily. People were killed at the highest rate in the world. It was a poor country. Everyone dreamed about leaving El Salvador and left. So a lot of El Salvadorians moved to the US. And it's not something really unique or a miracle that happened. It's just like something was fixed in the country that was the biggest issue. It's like locking up the criminals, which was sometimes a hard time to do if the criminals are very organized and heavily armed, and so on. That was managed. That's not a great thing. It's a great thing that after fixing that, the country opted for openness. And they chose one thing that seemed very odd. So most people say, hey, that's crazy. That's like a crazy dictator who would go for that. El Salvador adopted Bitcoin. And let me try to explain to you why that was important in that situation. Bitcoin is not only the asset. It's not just the asset you buy and hope to sell again more. Bitcoin is a network. And it's a decentralized network that no government has been able to shut down. Anywhere in the world you can access this network. Everyone who has access to internet can access it the very same way. There's no privilege in it. Everyone who has cheap energy somewhere can get some of the remaining Bitcoin, but most are just using it, and they're using it as decentralized infrastructure. So Bitcoin has, over the 16 years it has existed, manifested as an asset on a decentralized network, and is now one of the most mobile forms of capital available. Capital is not always mobile. It's not that easy to transfer large amounts of wealth. Usually it's illiquid. You can't move it. Even if it's liquid, it has become more and more difficult to go via bank routes and transfer it. There's a lot of capital controls, banking compliance. It's really difficult to send large amounts of money. these days, and of course for bigger investments, in particular the country that needs a lot of infrastructure, industry, and so on, you need bigger investments. Bitcoin is a mobile form of capital. So just by putting that on a map and saying, okay, you have Bitcoin, we'll treat you well, that's a place that gives you certainty that nothing surprising will happen. We won't take your Bitcoin, we won't produce a difficult tax situation for you. We like it, we protect it, you're safe here, attracting people with capital. And that's all of the miracle story. It's suddenly Americans coming to El Salvador, and El Salvadorians who have lived in the US coming back to El Salvador just to visit. First you visit as a tourist, some like it so much they stay, they come back. Some buy an apartment, some start investing in ventures. And it's a very little change, but in a poor country, just like 20%, 30% increase in tourism and investment is a lot, is a big change, is a quick change. And now, Bukele has not found a miracle recipe. He has his problems. I'm very critical of some of the ways he tried to do it. The important thing is that he did not come up with Bitcoin. He did not come up with the Bitcoin adoption in the country. It was something that arose spontaneously. It was just one beach in the country. Someone came from outside and started to use Bitcoin to donate to kids who had nothing to do there, who were unemployed, who were not going to school, and pay them to be life guardians on the beach where lots of people are drowning because they have very high waves. It was that little adoption that people in the country could see, okay, that's positive, it's not bad, and then just like using that as an example was really all behind this success story. Being open to mobile capital, to the right people, and endorsing this kind of decentralized infrastructure. So that's why I think Bitcoin, of course, with these examples, suddenly it's coming back into the political discourse. There's a lot of momentum. The reason is just it's a discovery process. So it's one of the insights of the Austrian school. It's not smart people figuring out something for everyone else. It's people discover something works. And usually most of the scientists and academics don't understand it when it's emerging. Every important institution emerges this way. All the institutions that are important, language emerges this way, money emerges this way. It's a discovery of people using something and figuring out it works better. And that also lends it's this kind of decentralized structure in people discovering it themselves. So being open for this kind of discovery, being open to people and capital come to a place, being open to the kind of dynamic inequality that we produce, but understanding that it gives new potential, of course, is the only way to quickly change an economy. And you have to get rid of the idea that it's like now foreign change or foreigners coming in. If you're in a poor country, you need outside investment. And in particular, the country with a very low labor force that had brain drain over a long amount of time. Not because you have bad people, it's because like good people have an incentive to leave. You need to turn it around from brain drain to brain gain. That's the crucial thing. And now you are in the best situation you can imagine. Being so unique in Suriname, being the only majority Dutch-speaking country here, having this kind of cultural roots, having this large of a diaspora that's very successful outside of the country. That's an amazing potential a lot of countries would dream about. It's not the oil that is your important resource. Oil is potentially your biggest danger. It can be a curse. Rich countries are not always resource-rich countries. Some of the richest countries are the resource-poorest countries. Why? Because if you have access to resources that bring a lot of wealth, suddenly they're easily centralized, they're easily to be grabbed. And you make one wrong decision about that resource use, like you already spend it 3 times before it's there already. You use it for consumption, you use it for things that look like wealth. Like we cannot buy more stuff for us, that's why we are wealthy. That's a big danger. And economists call it the resource curse, because it's a curse. It looks like some magic. It's not the magic that brings you wealth. It's the use you make with that. Be able to use that capacity for savings coming in. And of course, you want to have it savings for local savings. Local people should see their wealth increase over time. And that's where I also think Bitcoin has something to add to the picture. It's something very new. So even in Europe, people haven't really figured it out. Most of the adoption is in wealthy places these days. The biggest Bitcoin adoption is in Switzerland, where I live. All the local banks around where I live are offering Bitcoin as an investment. Not because they liked it. So immediately, of course, most banks thought, okay, no. Something risky, speculative. If it works out, it hampers our business model. It tells you don't need a bank to use it, so it's something bad, evil. But then you realize, no, people are using it, and we're losing out so much money on not providing a service. Of course, we want to be a bank that sells you investment possibilities. And what have people realized? If you invest for a longer term, and you can wait for 4 years, which is not easy. If you can forget about your savings for 4 years and not need them, not touch them, not look at the price even, then Bitcoin is the best asset that has ever existed on the planet, because it has this immense appreciation, which was a discovery, how useful these scarce numbers can be. And the usefulness is not something in itself, it's not a number, it's really scarce numbers, but it's provable scarcity. It's provable. We know, and we have learned to trust an algorithm more than people, more than institutions, because algorithms are information. Information can be spread worldwide, and information cannot be controlled forever by anyone. Information wants to flow freely, and it makes our world so much better. But the really unjust, unfair structures of the past will not be able to survive for long, because we can talk to each other now all around the world. We can learn from each other. We can compare our experiences. We can share information. It's not in books anymore that you can burn. It's data. And with Bitcoin, it fits into 12 words that you can remember. And that's amazing. Our ancestors, the few who were able to move savings from one place to the other because they had to sew gold coins into their clothes, into their robes to hide them, which was difficult to do. But of course, much easier than hiding land or other resources. And that's the point of Bitcoin. And by people realizing that it's a savings device, if you hold on to it, you're pretty well off in the long run, and that's an incentive for saving. So it changes a habit. It's a self-reinforcing habit. That's why more and more people are starting, like put some money. Just in Switzerland, it's very common that people do a savings plan. So every month you put 100 francs into the same asset. You don't want to time it. You don't know. You're not a trader. You're not a professional. You're not in for speculation. You want to, over the long run, have some of that wealth that you earn be stacked safe for your future self, for your children, for your family. And that's usually how you do it. You're not speculating. You're not looking at prices or around. You need to adopt something where if you add gradually a little bit, as you could do with the real coins in the past, and we still have piggy banks. And we tell our children saving is like putting coins in the piggy banks. Of course, it's a lie. It's like Santa Claus. It doesn't work. If you put coins in the piggy bank and look at the purchasing power, you see it's a lie. Even if you had like cents of the dollar, if your kids started putting dollars in the piggy bank, and 30 years later, as a grown-up, would like to use that savings and looks at the purchasing power, would realize, oh my God, even with the dollar, like seemingly, comparably stable and safe, it's not a device you can save in for the long term, for decades. Most people underestimate that loss of purchasing power, and that makes it that difficult. So with Suriname, a kind of green field,
bit unspoiled in some ways. Just imagine what potential that country has if it avoids mistakes, as I've done, if it doesn't take the wrong lessons, do it as the rich already do, like you gotta spend that and invest in that and do that from a centralized perspective, which you always get wrong. But encourage people to take that opportunities, be relatively more attractive than other locations around the world, attract mobile people first, those with mobile capital. It would be an economic miracle that would even put Singapore to shame, because you have much more resources available, you have much more place available, and you have much more access available. And there's much more need these days for new places, decentralized places, because a lot of people are losing the trust in their institutions and developing societies. And of course, that's part of the momentum and the changes in Trump or Minet or other places. People are becoming open to new ways, new changes, and new places like Suriname, potentially. So thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks for being here.
I have a couple of questions for you as well. My first question would be, in Suriname we have several problems, right? Systemic problems that have gone on for decades. We're a young nation, so still figuring out how to grow and how to walk and how to run. One of these problems that I see across the board, whatever political party, whatever politicians throughout the history of our nation, is that they always try to look for solutions by government, right? How can we create a new industry, and how can government create that new industry? How can government create new jobs? And there are a lot of extractive industries, so we partner with foreign companies that come and extract our natural resources, and then we get pennies on the dollar. So you mainly have this problem where government is trying to solve a problem, but then also creates a problem. Right now there is a national discussion ongoing about Chinalco coming to create the outside industry, and our country receiving a small percentage. And historically within our country, whether it be in the gold industry or oil industry, it's always been government with a foreign multinational that's creating jobs. There's not as much coming from the private sector. And libertarians, Austrian economists are more about encouraging private sector growth and development. So how would you tackle these systemic issues in Suriname? What would the thought process be as an Austrian economist?
It's not a unique situation. It's almost all around the world, because that was part of a wrong perception of the Western success story. Because there was so much wealth and capital inherited, and then if you put centralizing locations, because more of them became immobile, in particular industrialization, you had industrialists that invested a lot, and then they're stuck. So one economic concept is to think of government as a kind of stationary bandit. It's not the roaming bandit, it's wandering somewhere. It's you specialize in one place, and you try to siphon off wealth. Of course, by concentration, also you have network effects. So it was the same places where all the wealth came together, that were sometimes also the centers and seats of governments, like Vienna. Vienna was, when the Austrian school emerged, one of the 5 most important cities in the world, so like Shanghai today, or Shenzhen, or Singapore, a very rapidly developing city. It was also the center of the Habsburg Empire and the bureaucracy. And still Vienna today has inherited so much cultural capital and wealth, with
It's like considered one of the best places in the world, quality of life. But it's the current government in Vienna that, of course, uses all that for their prestige and regionalization. So almost every Viennese believes in big government and more government. And if you look at places like Suriname or other places, you have not inherited that much. So you say the state capacity is lower. But the state capacity in Vienna is not higher because the politicians are brighter or better and you just need to get better politicians. No, it's because it's something else. It's habits, mentalities, wealth that's already there, resources that you can use, that you've inherited, that they've inherited, that we've inherited in Vienna without really much merit and without understanding where they come from. And then it's easy to live off them, and it looks like, oh, Vienna is so well run. So it must be the government of Vienna. Of course, we have a city government, and it must be the Austrian government, must be something great. But compared to Suriname, I'd say even the Swiss government is worse. Partly that. And it's like very hard to understand how can you say that. It's because Switzerland is rich for historical reasons, unique reasons, unimaginable reasons. They avoided 3 big wars. Not only the 2 world wars, they avoided the 30 Years' War. For very unique historical reasons, and they were the first Central European place to have, because of the religious diversity in Switzerland, not go for one centralized, religiously centered power. So you had the Protestants come in to Switzerland from other places. They settled in the cities. They were called the Huguenots. Of course, the Protestant dissidents settled there. And because they were not part of the structure, they had to reinvent themselves. They had to come up with something. And they brought their tool-making skills and they applied it to new industries that were not protected. But there was no government because the government didn't know that it's a new industry emerging. No one knew it. And at the time, of course, was the guilds being part of government functions. It was the kings that were kicked out for various reasons in Switzerland. So they inherited such a unique condition that exactly combined savings and entrepreneurship for a very long time. So the Swiss cities were already rich a long time ago. We didn't see it because it was not integrated in the global order. But some of the cities had huge treasuries of gold hidden in their walls, like Bern, which is the capital city now, had a huge treasury. 200 years ago, they were one of the biggest investors. They invested in exploring South America, for example. Like that kind of investment, huge ventures. Now Bern is the center of the destruction of Switzerland because it attracts a political class. And this kind of class is always people who try to live at the expense of other people. And they are wealthy, they don't have a reality check, they can come up with stupid ideas, and they want to do everything like the Germans do, copy any kind of nonsense. So from Bern in Switzerland now, which was one of the best investors as a city, is now impoverishing Switzerland. It's still very rich, but looking at the potential and its uniqueness, it's a small country. It's just like 8 million people, and not only part of them have that kind of wealth. Why has it not produced more? Why is it not even richer? Why is it not sending spaceships to the moon? Why is it not producing new modular nuclear reactors that they could send here? No, they are not leading in all of the industries. They're still relatively doing very well. But I think the guilt of the Swiss establishment is even higher because there was so much to waste, and they are still doing it. They are wasting and they are hampering. And it's Swiss is still relatively good because they inherited such unique circumstances. Austria inherited only part of that, centralized earlier, did not avoid the wars and all the wars. Still is a very wealthy country, but it's a stagnant country. It's a country where a majority of the population thinks and is sure unconsciously that their children will have a worse time than they have. And of course it explains why they're not having kids anymore, why those societies are dying out. They are very pessimistic, they are very stagnant. So politics is universal, government is universal. It's not unique in Suriname. It's in our intuition, of course. We want to have someone in charge and do it. We have the bad role models. We think, oh, these big institutions and big governments are doing great stuff, and that's why we don't have it, because no one is paying for more schools and hospitals and all the good things you can have, and you're not seeing where it comes from, like this high education level in Europe. It did not start by spending money on education. It started by cultural change towards more literacy, curiosity, and wealth. Wealth was the most important part. Because if you're wealthy, you can afford that you spend, Europeans now spend until the age of 25 in institutions with very little to show for. I mean, they don't improve their skills, they are not becoming better entrepreneurs, they are not developing better technology, they have titles and certificates and degrees and feel very special, but the whole expenditure is only there because of the wealth they have, and that's how it started. Of course, you could send your kids to the monastery if you could afford it, and it's the same thing. So it's usually the causality is all the other way around. You have a rich, wealthy society, and then you have the leisure. That's where school comes from, the word leisure. You have the leisure to not have to survive every day. That you can now learn something new, you can experiment with something new, you can allow your kids the leisure to do something else than what they need now for survival. So it's not spending more money on education that lifts the level. It's a cultural change, it's a wealth change, and if you have the right institutional structure, hopefully leads to a higher level of education, but also hopefully to a higher level of skill and value creation. So sorry for being too long-winded. It's a very, very broad question.
All right, I have one more question and then we pass it off to the audience. In Suriname, one of the main restrictions of economic growth, or constrictors of economic growth, the growth of the private sector and GDP growth of our economy, is an under or non-established capital market, a lack of flows of capital or investment from foreign investors or foreign institutions directly into the private sector. Most large investments flow through either government or through large corporations. So you've been here now, you've been learning about Suriname for quite some time now. What are our main constrictions that you have learned about as to why our private sector cannot grow and thrive as rapidly as it could or should by attracting foreign investment, and how would we be able to improve?
Well, I think a lack of a capital market is just a symptom of a lack of capital. Capital is not just money, numbers, in a table or something. It's really the willingness and capacity to reinvest what you earn in enterprises, and a feeling that you can improve your life with that, and that you can keep it if it goes well. Usually it takes foreigners, capital markets usually are there to like integrate into the world economy and attract outside capital. And that's a good thing. It's just the structure you have these days is not a very open, easily accessible one. It comes at a hefty price being integrated. So I don't think you could just like imitate a capital market from elsewhere. It has a very high compliance cost, control cost, because of course big nations want to control flows of money as well. So I think you need to be more innovative and think about who are the people for whom you can improve a little bit relative the attractiveness of this location. And maybe you have to answer why should you invest here. And that's a competition game for most people. You look at things, and most people are not able to bear that uncertainty. So it's usually it's a small group of people. It's just because it's a global competition now that it becomes relevant. I think going a more innovative way, probably integrating new financial systems that are not geopolitically controlled, like payment rails these days, like Bitcoin, would offer unique opportunities if you get that right and have a Bitcoin-friendly new digital capital market in Suriname. I think that would be a big
chance or potential. I mean, it's not guaranteed, it's not a magical recipe. It's just like figuring out what can we do relatively better than other places to attract what kind of capital, what kind of capital would be interested in that location. I think Suriname would do very well in reaching out to culturally aligned people, and there you are really lucky that a lot of Dutch entrepreneurs are about to leave the Netherlands, have already left, are looking elsewhere, because doing business in Europe is not getting easier. We feel the same stagnation, not as bad as other places, but still I see lots of Dutch people looking into Dubai, settling in Dubai. We have in South Africa, you have the Afrikaans-speaking community, of which a lot have left already. More are considering to leave because the circumstances are not getting better. They have a lot of entrepreneurial acumen, a lot of resources. So I think being open to these communities, also Belgium, as the language-speaking entrepreneurs that are not happy in Belgium, that are looking for conditions. So I think that's the low-hanging fruits. If you can, and then you have to look what rails do these people need, what form is their capital, how can you bridge it here. Maybe it's some banking, joint ventures. It may mean regulation, but in the sense, have clarity. A lot of regulations just producing paperwork and all of this kind of filter. Like not let not everyone in, but produce a cost, so only those who afford the cost are serious. It's just a risk. It works sometimes because people who are not very serious are not able to spend the time and money on the regulatory cost. And it's not a very good filter. So I think we can have a more innovative filter, make it easier for particular groups of investors, special economic zones, exactly. That was the recipe of the Emirates and other places. So you don't do it for the whole country, you look for regions that need development and where you can open up sandboxes and say, okay, let's try out. If they do bad stuff, it doesn't work out, that's no problem. It's a part of the country where you can experiment on. But that, I think, is an easy low-hanging fruit in figuring out what kind of industries would be ready to move to a special economic zone. And you could have, it doesn't have to be an industry zone, you can a huge trend is medical tourism, innovative medical therapies. I think Suriname is destined to be a place to find innovative new medical treatments, maybe based on ancient wisdom, on the forests, on the biggest resource we have here, and bring it here. But in order to attract, I think you have to carve out special provisions. You want to limit the risk. You want to have everyone come into the country. If it fails, it's like bad therapies and those. But to experiment with small spaces, so that's called sandboxing and special economic zones. Most special economic zones don't work that well. Those that work best are special administrative zones that also have their own legal structure, easier structures, more digitalized structures that you can experiment with.
Are there any questions from the audience? Please introduce yourself very briefly and then ask your questions within a minute.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Taghizadegan, Mr. Rahim. I'm sorry, your name is quite unique. I'm going to stick with Mr. Rahim if that's okay with you. I have a question. You said that wealth is not natural, at least poverty is the stagnant. And actually, I think you've made an evolutionary argument. You've also added some history in it. And also you've added complex systems in it as well. Yeah, but how do you define wealth based on all those factors? And if there is a definition, what should we strive for?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Wealth is not easily defined. It's certainly not just material. So there was one argument from an important Austrian economist, Ludwig von Mises, who said that we can have, of course, for the Austrian school it's subjective. It's people attain more of their own preferences. And if you prefer to live a simple life in the forest, that's your wealth. If you're free to do so, it's not because you have to, it's your choice. Of course, a simple life can be a wealthier life. Having more time with your family can be a wealthier life. But fundamentally, the line is what say most people prefer, if you see it as an option, life to death and health to sickness or disease. And that was a change, you know. The survival mode of our ancestors meant that most of the children would bring to the world, if it changed from the original pattern, the more Paleolithic, Neolithic lifestyle didn't have many children. Raised to wean up slowly, but once you go to an agricultural, settled societies, then it changes. And it was normal for like my great-grandparents that they would have 7 children, and they would bury 4 of those. So one of the big changes was the increase of life expectancy through lower child mortality. And it was a few breakthroughs that passed on, and then of course it's like some material necessities that have made it possible that many more people live to die of cancer, which is a bad thing. But in our past, we didn't have much cancer because most people would die before reaching that age where your body and organism will have sustained growth. Of course, now these days we have civilizational diseases as well, a very unhealthy lifestyle. So it's not linear. So wealth doesn't mean to become more modern at every price. But there was a breakthrough between the Malthusian area, that's the area of survival, which was true for most of human existence, where our livelihood is limited by the access to resources. It's high access to calories, that's the fundamental limitations. So if you have more people, they will be poorer per person. A modern, wealthy society in that regard means more people does not mean that you have to be poorer per person. It's a win-win thing. It's not this competition of survival. And that's a breakthrough. That's what I mean by wealth. That's what most people prefer. Not consciously, but when they look at it, they move there. You can see the migration patterns as always to places that allow for more wealth. And that's like well-being, surviving, your children surviving, and also this kind of potential dynamic, positive dynamic, where it's not competition again, but you know, I can have a better life, and my children, and the children of my neighbor can also have a better life at the same time. And that's a very recent condition, unfortunately. So a lot of this was, we were limited by scarce resources, and it was constant survival. And a lot of people still live in this kind of mode and thinking, and it leads to win-lose thinking, as if he has more, I have less. A modern wealthy society is a win-win society where someone can have more and you can have more as well. And that's the important change. So it's not a clear-cut definition. So from the Oslo School of Economics, wealth doesn't mean to have more material wealth. It's being able to see more of your preferences, what you want in life to have, and it can be anything with this kind of choice, not be limited by what is, but be more unlimited in living to our true potential. Do something that is not linked to calorie production. Doing something like music, like art, something that enhances our experience.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rahim. I also have a technical question, if you don't mind. Austrian economics seems to approach economics as a complex adaptive system with spontaneous order and inverted properties. I happen to have studied it. I did some background research before I came in here. My specific question is, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Austrian economics does not provide metrics. At least it doesn't quantify stuff, you know, at least what I've read. You know, I studied engineering, and in my mind, you need to have a system, and then you need to have metrics in order to be able to determine what's good or bad or not, and how to improve upon it. So my specific question is, shouldn't it be understandable, calculatable, and quantifiable? At least what is your reaction to that?
Yes, originally I was an engineer, and there's nothing wrong about measuring and having quantities. But it's wrong to assume that that's the only way to do science, because very complex systems don't allow for this kind of prediction. So it's like a trader, speculator who thinks he's a genius because he's calculating all the curves and getting all the numbers right. Those are usually the worst, because they think they are more intelligent than they are. In complex systems, usually you have to do with qualitative answers, with heuristics, with just getting intuition. It's more an art than a science in the more complex parts. There's nothing wrong about numbers. Those numbers, when they are helpful to you, they are helpful in complex problems, like more complex engineering, physical problems, it's really complex systems, in investing, which is a very complex part of interactive systems. Be aware that the numbers are only a tool for you, the heuristics. The main tool of numbers in investing is to discipline you. It's not to do something foolish because you have resisted your model and you follow it slavishly. That helps a lot of people, but it's not more scientific in that sense. And it's true for many complex things, like you are not a better parent if you calculate exactly how to educate your child. It's some things are complex, it's more of an art than numerical science. But Austrian economics is not opposed to empirical work, it's not opposed to figuring out and working at data. It just does not overestimate the kind of data, and the most important thing, it doesn't use it as a sham procedure to bluff people. Because I could project lots of data here, and everyone will go, oh wow, that's scientific, that's useful. That's useless. Economics prediction models are useless, and we know that empirically. If you gather predictions by economists, and you look at them in the long term, you figure out it's worse than rolling the dice. It's just worse to listen and look at the numbers of an economist if it's about the future, about what it should do, than just rolling the dice and do whatever you want. And that's very unique about complex systems. So be very aware that there's an expert trap in complex systems. Because experts tend to overestimate what you can know numerically, and they will tell you, oh, there's no evidence for that. And disprove a lot of like human intuition and experiences. So sometimes it's better to ask your grandmother than an expert in some fields. Not all, but some important areas.
Fair enough, thank you.
Mr. Rahim, thank you for the beautiful presentation. I just want to ask you for some advice, yeah? Based on our current situation. We've seen an inflation of 900% in the last 10 years. That's crazy. At the same time, there's a brain drain going on right now in Suriname. We are lacking skilled labor. At the same time, you're saying that people with wealth, entrepreneurs, are seeking ways to leave certain nations where they have policies that are negative for their businesses. So, when you look at the Suriname future outlook, we have oil and gas developments that are lying ahead. Everybody is going wow. But when you look at that thing I just said, brain drain, lack of skilled labor, a government that consumes 60 to 70% of our labor force. We all know that oil and gas will create a tremendous influx of immigrants in Suriname. So, if you take into consideration the 900% inflation that we have in the last 10 years, also if you look at the geopolitical developments with Donald Trump and his trade tariff wars, we will be importing inflation on one side, and at the same side, with the normal developments that are coming, the amount of inflation that we will get due to oil and gas and the real estate prices going up, the energy prices going up, because we will be having more people, they will be consuming more. I don't think that the Suriname people are aware of what lies ahead. And also, when you take into consideration that 60 to 70% of these people are working for the government, probably with salaries maybe around 500 to 600 US dollars, the ones that do really good, even lower, much lower. What do we need to do with this information that I just gave you? What economic measurements do you roughly, I know you don't know the nation all intra, but are there any economic measurements that you could advise us based on the experience that you have internationally, even if it's just 3, so that we can take measurements just to make sure that the local people that we have, they will not be, overwhelmed by the inflation that lies ahead. I mean, my best brother here next to me, that's Sergio Nagan, he came with an amazing plan of building a second city. Sorry that he came with an amazing plan of building a second city. Are these, is that something? What measurements? What advice would you give us? Thank you.
It's not that exceptional that you have increasing prices. The dynamic is quicker, but prices are only the messenger. Unfortunately, it's the message. Don't shoot the messengers. A lot of people that blame the high prices that they have to pay. It's sad, but it's another reality that emerges. It's more obvious in Suriname, and people have been learning from that in a way or partly dollarized already as an economy. You don't trust that much of your savings to the Surinamese dollar. It won't change by forcing people whatever way to do that. The increasing prices, of course, I mean, if there's change, if it's coming in, that's a big risk that it will be overwhelming. So the only way to go with that is increased productivity. And look at it this way, we have lots of people who now take a relatively low salary, but think they are secure in that way. A lot of that potential is wasted. I think people can reach out to people and show people and activate the kind of entrepreneurship we have here and bring in to find ways for people to be productive. Because you have labor scarcity, so there are ways to be productive. You have to figure that out. Sometimes it needs the right procedures. Sometimes it's a kind of teaching that's skills-based. Sometimes it's really innovative new projects. City projects, of course, are unique in that way. Like, it sounds like a crazy idea, build a new city, but that's what special economic zones, special administrative zones do in a way. You localize development in some parts. It's very hard to do it right, because of course just doing another project will increase more prices for all the factors that are scarce, construction materials, and labor as well. So how do you make people benefit from that? Is help them see their labor as a scarce resource and figure out a way that it can be used in the most value creative way possible. But there are no easy recipes. So with a lot of money coming in, even investment coming in, people coming in, will be changes, and no change is positive for everyone. So for some it will create hardships, but it's not the hardships, not the prices, they're not the problem, they're just the messenger. They're just the message that you get then. You can try to prepare yourself, and one way to prepare for changes, uncertainties, of course, increase your savings and try to find a way to increase your savings over time. And one way to increase your value productivity is, of course, have a more entrepreneurial mindset. Think about what kind of skills will be needed more, how can I advance, how can I be close to these kind of values. But there's no way you can measure your way out of that problem. Scarce resources, long demands, I just say the change will be positive. There's a risk to change. The biggest risk is to use it just for consumption if new wealth comes in. If you use it for investment, of course it will drive on prices, but it will drive some of the better labor that you need to develop over time. It will give high incentives, so you will have a higher disparity of wages. Some people will be able to earn much more money when they adapt. You need to cope with that. It will be against your intuition. So a lot of people, when they see it, they will not like it. That's the way. That happens. In Dubai, people have to live with the fact that now 80% of the population are foreigners. That's a very hard thing to take and accept. You are lucky in that there are lots of foreigners that are potentially culturally close because they are Surinamese and they've left Suriname, or speak the language, or they can find an attachment, but still it's a big challenge. So wealth has a price. This kind of development will have a price, and a lot of people will not like that price when they see it. Still, as an economist, I think in the long run, if they look back to their life and they see the alternative that they can see, they will prefer this development if it's done well. But it will never be, you can't promise politics, promising everyone will be better off. No, because not everyone is ready and willing to take the change, and some people are comfortable in the situation they are at. It's not that sustainable. You can have a not changing stagnant situation where people are relatively similar but a bit worse every year. Or you have this dynamic inequality where some will figure it out first, make a lot more money, and some will figure out how to learn from them, and some will feel an obligation to carry along their communities and their families and their friends, but not everyone will. So I think if politics can do something, it's help with that process of change, make it more gradual, incentivize people to spread skills they have, to feel that obligation to carry along their communities. That's how it was done in Singapore, what I mentioned. That's the best political structures can do, that's the best parties can do, any kind of organizations can do. Be ready to cope with the change and help as many people as possible along to make the best of that change. But it will not be a sweet magical recipe for everyone, where you just wake up and everyone is living a European lifestyle without having to change. That's impossible. Some change will be very hard and very hard to accept. But I think relative to other countries that also have to change, you are in a better situation. So I'd still be very optimistic about Suriname if you can manage that openness and you can see that there is, in the long run, more for everyone to get. But politically, it will be very challenging.
Politically, yeah. Thank you.
Evening. With our small population, what kind of changes can we bring through? And with the fact that we have a small population, we have a lot of bad things that depends on the fact that we have a small population. But what kind of changes can we bring through the fact that we have such a small population?
Listen, it's always best to accept reality as it is. It's like, you can feel like, oh my God, we are so few people, oh my God, it's such a poor country. That's the way it is. That's what you have. It offers some advantages, it offers some hardships. So change will be, it's more difficult, but it can be faster if you have a small population. It's more mobile, so there are unique advantages having a small population. It will be more inequality if you have a small population. So, people are scarcer, so those people figure out how to make best use of their change and profit much more, much quicker. So the cohesion is the biggest problem. Small population, big change. How can you maintain your identity, your cohesion with that? That's really the challenge. But it's not. Don't look at the problems. That's your reality. So It's a beautiful country with a low density of population. You have a lot of space. You have a lot of diversity for a small population. You have a lot of languages. One thing I'm really impressed is the English language skills here. I wouldn't have imagined it's not your first language. It shows a general openness of the population. Of course, you can find all kinds of reasons, but it's not actually just what you have. And I think it's also being a small population. You have to be more open. You don't have your own, you can impose your own language and culture and everything. You have to accept things as they are. And so look at it as how is it upon potential, how is it good what you have? Because you can't change it. You can't imagine it being bigger, and I always advise, don't see your limitations as a kind of victimness. It's like, okay, we can be better because we're so small, we can't have more because we don't have that. No, there are always advantages, there's always trade-offs in economics. Trade-offs means you always is like, more of that means less of that. That's how economics works, and just make a good choice with that and make best use of what you have. And part of that is being small, means some change can be quicker, faster. That's a unique advantage as well.
Good evening. Thank you for your presentation. My question is, how do you think AI can have a positive effect on changing the Surinamese economy? Because not everyone has the access to internet. Not every student has the opportunity to get a higher education. How do you think AI can improve our economy in the current condition from the current condition to higher heights?
I'm relatively optimistic, but also because we don't have the choice. It's never good to be negative about what's happening. It affords a lot of possibilities. So the AI large language models are a tool. It will have a tremendous impact, not as quickly as people think. It's usually with modern technologies and new technology. First you overestimate it. You think it will change immediately everything, and then in the long run you underestimate it. It will have a tremendous impact. The good thing is it goes for something which is really scarce in Suriname. It replaces mostly skilled labor. So that's a big challenge for a lot of people. A lot of skilled processes, white collar works, can be automatized and will be automatized. It will take a long time before really there are less jobs because its processes take a long time to change. And fundamentally, I'm optimistic that you find, of course, new ways to do. But for skill labor that you've been doing, you've been doing it for the last few years, and you continue doing it. And a lot of Europeans have this kind of jobs. That's much more of a challenge for Suriname. It's a unique opportunity. As for demographically shrinking populations, that's also in Europe. We know that in the future we'll have much fewer people, much fewer, labor will be scarce. So it's good that we have tools that replace some labor and allow to increase the productivity of those who can use the tools. They are never equally available to everyone, but be optimistic about the internet and AI. There's never been a technology that has been so widely available, so cheaply. Of course, not everyone has access yet, but it's not that difficult. You can have Starlink even in the jungle these days. Of course, not everyone will have it now, know it, afford it, but it has become so much easier. If you look at other technologies in the past, like having railways and stuff, it took much longer. It was much more difficult to attain. So that's your luck. It's a digital age. You have access to digital information almost at the same level as everyone else living in rich countries. It's the same kind of internet you can have access to. You can read the same pages I'm reading, the same books I'm reading. You can have them digitally or scanned. You can get almost the same amount of information I get. You have access to tools, almost the same tools. Of course, there's some subscriptions still to pay, but relatively you can have exact the same tools that I'm using, and it's not that difficult, not that unaffordable. And there's even a digital money that you can use in the very same way I can use it, everyone can use it. And these kind of digital technologies are really a boom, a good thing for societies because you can overstep some steps. You know, you can have internet access without having radio or TV everywhere, or even without having books going everywhere, so you can short run this kind of development. So fundamentally it's good for you. So I'd be very optimistic it help you, but it's not something that drops out of the sky. It's a tool that people can use, and so you can have one skilled laborer to work of 3 skilled laborers, and it's great if you have a scarcity. But it still needs the person to use the tool effectively, and not just for consumption.
Good evening. Also from my part, I want to thank you for your presentation, especially with regards to the Bitcoin issue. For the last 80 years, Suriname has been governed by interest groups with little or seldom their national interest in mind. And for the last 20 years, these interest groups have been heavily infiltrated by criminal organizations, which makes it very hard for entrepreneurs, especially in the export business, to get easily international banking transfers done. You mentioned Bitcoin as an opportunity to attract investors from outside. But how can we attract investors from outside coming in a society which, as Mrs. Motley looked at, because it's not only Suriname but the whole Caribbean, looked at as being run by criminal organizations? And you advocate Bitcoin, as I understood, more as an investment instead of an international legal branding.
Bitcoin fundamentally is an infrastructure where you can move wealth around the world. And it's a more transparent and open infrastructure, so it's not used that much by criminals. There are a few scammers that they use it, but it's more crypto. So I would advise not to waste too much time looking at crypto and stuff. Most of that is not worthwhile. It's scamming, speculative stuff. So Bitcoin is an infrastructure. Of course, I mean, you can focus on the challenge you have. I don't have a recipe how you get rid of criminals in a country. That's, of course, I advise to try away, but usually there are reasons for that. But I think if you look at alternatives, of course, there's like the banking structure, and there's the black market structure usually, and it's very hard to go in between. The problem is the banking structure has been politicized. The payment system we have are not neutral anymore. So that's an issue in particular for countries like these. There are more geopolitical reasons that you have problems with using the banking system. Part of the rationale is criminals using it, but it's really avoiding sanctions, or that people circumvent sanctions. It's avoiding that Russia loans money for Suriname and things like that. That's much more of a worry than some local criminal games. Of course, drug is an issue, but I don't think that's the driving force behind these things. So I think that's the opportunity and appeal of Bitcoin. It's neither a black market structure that's only used by criminals, nor it's the wide, clear banking structure that, of course, is based on the power structure you have in the world right now, which means that the US is the country that will not communicate any information on their bank accounts, but we want to look into every bank account everywhere else. So it's a very asymmetric situation. That's why you have a lot of controls and compliance. It's also a cartel. Of course, it controls itself. Banking itself is a cartel. Where you increase the regulation costs, so the new entrants have a hard time.
So I think that's the opportunity it provides. Still, I mean, it's not a natural solution. You have to figure out how to make that work in a society, and it needs a lot of entrepreneurship and infrastructure. In the US, it took the 60 years now to finally, slowly have enough infrastructure that there are, and politics until recently was opposed to it and tried to avoid an emergence, but at least the mining industry emerged in the US. At least there's some financial industry emerged in the US. Some big companies could adopt it. The same happened in other jurisdictions, but it took a long time. And that would be for Surinamese entrepreneurs to discover how to make it work, how to have the right payment rails, how to connect, to tap into this industry that's already existing. What tools can you use? What entrepreneurs can you bring here to open a subsidiary here and help you use their services? And it happens on a small scale. You already have 3 Bitcoin ATMs in the country, I've heard. So some entrepreneurs like Maria have tried to bring some of that infrastructure here, but it takes a while to discover that. But of course, it's not a magical recipe against the gang criminality and against the difficulties of the existing financial structures.
No, mainly what I meant is if we want to attract foreign investors who are looking for new opportunities and make use of the Bitcoin, why do you promote Bitcoin as an investment product instead of a legal tender which makes it possible to do payments all over the world for the investors who come and invest here, have a product to export because they want to be paid, and it's very hard with all the things that go on in the Caribbean for normal banking. I think it would be much easier if Bitcoin should be international legal tender and not only an investment model.
Yeah, but that's international and it's not going to happen soon. That it's accepted by a lot of governments and made into an international unit. So it only comes from discovery for enterprises, and so far it has not worked out that much as I would have hoped it to work. So people are not bringing the Bitcoin here because they can pay with it. Payment for consumption is not such big of an issue for most people. When I just use dollars here, it's not that big of an issue to use it. It can be attractive if you have a lot of merchants accepting it, then people who have Bitcoin will come and visit, and that's what happened in El Salvador. But it was overrated in a sense, there's not that much payment transactions going on. And one of the reasons is that Bitcoin has been discovered to be uniquely useful as a savings device. And you don't spend your savings first. That's why gold has been around for a long time. And you can buy gold everywhere and sell it everywhere, almost everywhere. It's very little used for payments. It never ever happens that you want to sell a car and someone comes to you and tells you, well, take my gold coins. Even if they're better payment, is like you bring a bunch of like banknotes for a cash transaction or just one gold coin, which would be much better. But the reason is you give it up last because it's hidden. It's like your savings for bad times. And that's how it has been used. It will be used, and it is used for more payments. So I'm already using Bitcoin for payments, much more than I used in the past. It's coming incrementally. And as a entrepreneur, you can try to figure out if there are people who want to pay for that. But usually you'll be frustrated that there's little transaction. The network effect is not strong enough yet. It can work with a lot of merchants in a place, accepted, and then it attracts people. But for international payments between companies, you have to find a company that already understands it and uses it, and then it can work. So yeah, try to reach out to suppliers. If you have suppliers overseas, more and more people and businesses are using Bitcoin, and you will find suppliers, but then you have to have Bitcoin to pay them. So if you don't have Bitcoin, it doesn't help you as a payment rail there. Unless, some fintech entrepreneurs are offering solutions where you just use the infrastructure and you send dollar-denominated value across the Bitcoin infrastructure.
Were there any more questions from the audience? No more questions? Okay, with these these last remarks of Mr. Rahim, we have come to the closing of our question round. I would like to thank Mr. Rahim for his contribution, and of course I would like to thank the audience for their participation. And I would like to call to the front one more time Ms. Maya Baru for her closing remarks.
Yes.
I would like to thank everyone that attended tonight. I hope you all enjoyed the evening, and I hope that you have been inspired to think about our problems and some solutions differently, and think out of the box in regards to how we can develop our nation and how we can approach problems regarding our nation. I would like, again, to thank you for attending. We will be continuing the evening with an informal part of networking, so you can speak to Rahim personally and ask questions personally as well, and feel free, of course, to enjoy each other's company. Thank you so much, and enjoy the evening.
En met deze laatste woorden van Marco Zeeuws, zoals hij het aan gegeven, we komen aan het einde van de avond, of tenminste het formele gedeelte van de avond. Ik wil nog een speciaal woord van dank uitbrengen aan het mediateam van mevrouw Maya Baru voor de vaststelling van de avond. Ook aan de lucrative marketing en communications en events en natuurlijk mevrouw Maya Baru. Een hartelijk applaus voor haar, want zij is Respect van u alle gelukkige avond toewensen. Het informeel gedeelte gaat vanaf nu in. We zien u naar de volgende keer. Goedenavond.